Just as a side note to the Book Nook thing, you would be surprised at Lucille Packard Hospital, and I'm sure many hospitals like that, how much education happens in that place. One of the times when Eli was hospitalized over there, one of the elementary school teachers from El Carmelo, who had been Eli's teacher at El Carmelo, was now a Palo Alto Unified School District teacher at Lucille Packard. So he showed up at Eli's room with a stack of books and said, "Eli, we got to get started." And Eli was like, "Ah." So there's a lot of great things that happen. So today, we're at the end of the year. I hope you have all of your resolutions ready and are set to begin with a fresh page as we move into the new year. Different Christian traditions call this Sunday different things. When I was in Germany a year ago, they were getting ready towards the end of the year as we were, but the Protestants have a different name for the last Sunday of the year. We call it Christ the King, along with most liturgical Christian traditions in North America. But in Germany, they struggle on the Lutheran side of the house because they're very, very jealous and envious of the Roman Catholic observance of All Saints Sunday at the beginning of November, but can't bring themselves to observe it also. They have to watch it from a distance and go, "Oh, that looks like such fun. Why can't we do that?" And so instead of having Christ the King Sunday, they have today what is called Ewigkeit Sonntag, which is Eternity Sunday, which is Lutheran All Saints Day, which I don't think is catching on quite like they hoped. But nonetheless, there you go. So Christ the King Sunday, there's been a lot of angst about the language because why not queen? Why do we have to stick with king? Sometimes I have heard different references where we've talked about the reign of Christ, which I actually like. It leads us forward into a kind of talking about what does Christ's kingship, maybe we don't use that word so much, but what does that mean for us on a daily basis? But I want to start by going through the gospel text in a little bit of detail because there is a lot jam-packed into those verses, and we're getting it at kind of the wrong time of year. This verse should sound familiar to you just from the standpoint that whenever we hear about Pilate, in my head I'm thinking about Holy Week, right? Because that's when Pilate shows up on the scene. So let's take a moment and just look at the characters, so to speak, of the story. We have Pilate, and who is Pilate? Is he the king of that territory? And the answer is no. The king of that territory is Herod. But Herod is not really the king. He's kind of king lowercase. Like he got the king cutlery and plates and things like that, but he's not really the king. And as far as like say being in charge, he is not. In Rome, years prior to the events that are happening here, there was probably a meeting with Caesar who sat down with the chief lieutenants saying it's time to put in a new governor in the Holy Land over, of course it wasn't called that at the time, but in that area, and we need to find just the right person because that place is a nightmare and a hot mess. And they all sat around and thought, who's going to get the short straw? And then they thought, that maybe isn't the best way to do this. And they sat there for a while, and one of them said, you know what? I got a guy. I got a guy. And that guy is Pilate. Pilate, right? Pilate. He's a bruiser. He'll go in, he'll keep a lid on that place. So Pilate is sent to Jerusalem. Now, he's not the only Roman in that territory. So Caesarea Maritima, which is a little north of Jerusalem and on the coast, would have been the main fortress that the Romans would be receiving soldiers for the occupation of that territory. Now, when we get to this point in time, Pilate has already developed a reputation for putting his thumb down aggressively in any number of situations to keep the peace. So you can imagine that the locals wouldn't have been giant fans of Pilate. First off, he's not Jewish. He is the occupying governor, and he's violent. He puts people down with the sword. So now we've got this other guy in the story, Jesus, right? And what is this story? It's not a story of Jesus as king, it's Jesus as prisoner. So we have Christ the King Sunday, and we have this tremendous story of Jesus under arrest. The Bible's a big book. There are other stories that could have been used, right? Triumphant Easter, something like that. No. We're pulling back into Holy Week. So now Pilate and Jesus are in this scene. Pilate's job is to keep a lid on things. Jesus is not helping keep a lid on things. He keeps kicking over the anthill. He keeps causing problems. And as you can see by this powerful and yet simple question that I remember my parents asking me on rare occasion, mind you, what did you do? Right? What did you do? There's a mess. What did you do? Now, what's interesting is that most of the time when we hear this passage in isolation at the wrong time of the year, sometimes even when we hear it at the right time of the year, we miss what Jesus did. What did he do, right? Was it he was too good of a teacher? Is it that he healed that woman? This has got to be stopped, right? Tomorrow, he's going to be getting cats out of trees. He might feed people who are, this guy has got to be stopped. No, that's not what happened. The key event is something that is critical to Holy Week. But for some reason, when Christians sat down and said, these are the readings for Holy Week, they said, whoa, let's not have that one, though. Let's put it somewhere else. What reading is this? This is the reading where Jesus comes into Jerusalem with thousands of his followers, right? So what's happening in that story? Jesus is coming in from the east side, from the wilderness where no good thing comes. His followers, who are the ragged edge of society, are lining the street with their cloaks, and they are waving palm branches. Palm branches, the flag of the Maccabean revolt from generations before. Pilate, standing there probably with his binoculars, right, looking out going, this is not good. And he looks to the west side of the city, and there is another procession coming in. From the west side of the city, at the head, a general on a horse leading legions of Roman soldiers who would have just come down from Caesarea Maritima because it was the Passover, and more troops were needed to keep the peace in the city. So far, so good. That's our Holy Week story, right? And then they killed him because his Bible studies were too good. No, that's not what happened. Jesus and his thousands of followers storm the temple. Now, what happens here? Jesus and his followers are there 4 days. in the temple. Now, if we took Wall Street and the National Cathedral and Washington, D.C. political establishment and put it all in the same property, that's what that is. And Jesus walked in and shut the whole place down for days at a hit. Historical economists, which is a profession that I love that exists, have determined that the money going through the temple could have been as much as a half of the economy of Jerusalem. And Jesus has just ground it to a halt. The police and the chief priests are standing around, powerless to do anything, until finally they complained to Pilate, no, we can't have this. So suddenly, now we have a problem. Suddenly, Pilate has a problem. And Pilate's like, thanks, appreciate the problem. Jesus is dragged in. What have you done? I did this thing, and it's caused a problem. So what kind of king is Jesus? Our stories as people of faith, I would argue, particularly as people of faith in North America, where we have a certain strain of Christianity that in some ways is unique to our geographic context, is the idea of a Jesus who is not a prisoner, a Jesus who is not crucified, a Jesus who is heroic in all that he does, and while struggling, ultimately overcomes. A Christianity that talks about strength by force. A Christianity that talks about power over others. A Christianity that is perhaps consistent with the idea of Messiah as that would have been understood in Jesus' day. A George Washington kind of figure in some ways. But that's not who Jesus is. And generally, we don't like that. We don't like that. We prefer the power over, in some ways because it's the only kind of power we know. As human beings, the power over others is kind of the way the world works. And so this idea of strength in that fashion is something that is difficult for us to wrap our heads around. In fact, it was pointed out by one of our speakers during our mission moments, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." What? Think about how much we don't like this, though. We can watch movie after movie after movie in which there is a savior figure who usually struggles and gets to a hard spot, but comes back with a vengeance and cleans the house. Probably the most visual piece that I ever saw of that was the newer Superman movie in the new genre of Superman movies. Things get tough, he's captured, things aren't going well, and he finally busts out. He's in a space thing, and he busts out of the spaceship, and for a fleeting moment, before dashing down to beat the snot out of everybody, he floats just like this for a brief moment. I mean, it's subtle, but if you watch closely, this image of when Christ leapt off of the cross, killed all the Roman soldiers there. That's not how the story went. The other piece that I think we struggle with is that for those of us who grew up in the United States, we have this gut instinct against anything that smacks of royalty, right? I'm mindful that in German circles, that's even more complicated, and that you have all these von somebody still running around, and it makes it complicated. But this idea of someone to whom we owe our absolute obedience is difficult. And I think it's particularly difficult in the American context simply because we fought a whole war over that, right? But I think it's good for us sometimes to latch on to language that maybe feels a little awkward for us. This idea of Christ the King Sunday, a king who does not lord power over us, but models a power that is in sacrificial empathy and giving towards others. Power with, power for, but one that we profoundly owe our absolute obedience. And so as we conclude the second half of this year, in fact, the whole year, the second half being about the life of the Christian, the capstone piece is to be mindful that we are creatures of the Creator and that Christ is our King, but one who models in sacrifice and love. Amen.